Get everything set up here. Let's see. Okay, let's see here. Okay. Let's see. I want to see. I want to put out the live broadcast. Am I broadcasting right now? Let's see here. My channel. Let's do the live broadcast. Okay. Looks like we're ready to go here. So, good morning, D&D. That's right. It's a D&D, a game more stimulating than a hot cup of cappuccino or an espresso enema. And this time we're doing a special D&D episode of the RPG College based around the humor in Dungeons and Dragons. That's right. And of course, that last line was an homage to the late and great Robin Williams. Of course, we all know Robin Williams here. Yep, late great Robin Williams, who, among other things, in addition to being a great comedian, was also a longtime Dungeons and Dragons player. He played Dungeons and Dragons in his youth, and of course, it shows. Now, humor is an important tool in Dungeons and Dragons, of course, and here at the RPG College, we try to use humor whenever we can in our games, especially if you're using games with children or underage gamers. Humor helps bring them into the game and make them feel more involved. How many times at your table have you been sitting around and people start throwing out quotes from Monty Python and Princess Bride? Of course, that kind of table talk is always part that brings people together. This is a social hobby, and so humor is part and parcel of what we do. And so it's important for you to go out and remember not to try to be too serious when you play the game. Now, it's not to say that you can't have a serious gaming session. Don't get me wrong. I'm going to go ahead and jump on Facebook real quick and let people know that I'm streaming. So, streaming now live on Twitch, m.twitch TV/GamerSeuss. Topic: humor in D. Okay. Just wanted to put that out there. So if anybody wants to come join me once again. As I was saying, the late great Robin Williams was a known D&D player. Several of your favorite comedians have been known to play Dungeons and Dragons. So humor is a big part of their game too. Matthew Lillard, of course, a well-known comedian who plays Dungeons and Dragons. Patton Oswalt played in a game with Matt Mercer. We've had lots of different celebrity D&D players throughout the years. Robin Williams, like I said, is one of my personal favorites, but we've got others. Christian Slater plays. Orlando Bloom. The band members of the music group Rush are known to play D&D. So there's a lot of celebrity players that play D&D. Not to mention your regular D&D aficionados that you hear about on TV and social media all the time right now, like Deborah Ann Wall from True Blood and Daredevil, the Netflix series. Joe Manganiello from Magic Mike and also True Blood. you have a lot of great ones. Vin Diesel. Vin Diesel's been playing Dungeons and Dragons for most of his life. In fact, the Last Witch Hunter was kind of based around one of his old Dungeons and Dragons characters. So D&D has been quite a big part of the life of many of our favorite actors and comedians. And one of the things that these actors and comedians have in common is that they like, even though they could be doing serious subject matter, they do realize that there's a place for humor in their acting. And same thing's true in their role-playing games. You do want to be able to inject a little bit of humor. Throughout the ages, Dungeons and Dragons, well, I say the ages, of course, D&D first got its start in 1974. But although that really doesn't seem like that long a time, it actually has been quite a while. 45, 46 years, something in that range. I've been playing for 42. It was 3.5 years when I was, so 45 and a half, 46 years that the game has been around. But humor has always been a big part of it. If you were an old aficionado of the old Dragon magazine, the paper magazine, of course, now they're digital, but the paper magazine, you might recognize covers that looked a little bit like, let's see, the one on your screen right now. That's one of them from the April Fool's issues of Dungeons and Dragons. That one also could have been a Valentine's issue, but I believe that one was an April Fool's issue with the lovesick beholder and the suitor there. Every year when Dragon magazine was out, they used to publish a special April Fool's issue where they would do things like putting in humorous monsters that you can inject into your game. And there's nothing saying you can't still do that today. There were great humorous monsters that you could find stats from those Dragon magazines, and you can adapt the monsters in the monster manual or make monsters of your own that have their own humorous spin to it. How about a dragon who, instead of breathing fire or poison or something, breathed a type of confusion that caused people to act slapstick funny, a little bit of Keystone Cops type of Three Stooges type behavior. You could model a game after a Cheech and Chong episode. A lot of D&D, as Chris Perkins will tell you, he models a lot of his D&D sessions after sitcoms, which situational comedies. So of course humor is a big part of his games as well, and you could do that same thing to inject humor into your game. The main thing you want to remember is you don't want to be so serious the game becomes dull and unappealing. Dungeons and Dragons is a hobby. You want people to enjoy it and have fun when they come in and play. And some of that, there are people out there that want to be really serious about the game, and that's fine. It's absolutely okay to have real serious moments. Some of the best moments in D&D can be those really serious, dynamic, dramatic moments, like the death of a character, or finally beating a big boss, or delving into the deep, dark dungeon's depths, and the DM is describing the dungeon with the right amount of gravitas, and that's definitely a part of the game. But also, you got to remember that you can shake it up a little bit with some comedy too. A lot of DMs, for instance, like myself, Matt Mercer, Satine Phoenix, Taliesin Jaffe, Liam O'Brien, will use funny voices. Of course, Taliesin Jaffe, Liam O'Brien, Matt Mercer, they're voice actors. So, of course, that's a big part of their game. I'm not a professional voice actor, always wanted to be, but we use voices in our games to inject a little bit of comedy. And that's something you can do. Like, for instance, if you're playing as a player and you want to play a gnome character, you could talk really, really fast and string all your words together without any breaths at all. And you might even want to jot down what you're going to say and kind of read it through a couple of times before you actually say it out loud in person. So you're not even using necessarily a silly voice, but it's silly because of the fact that you don't come up for air and you say like six sentences without a breath. and that's comedic, and it also fits kind of the nomenclature of what a lot of people imagine a gnome to be. Or there's the stereotypical, and this is of course something that Robin Williams would have done, the Scottish brogue accent that you find in a dwarf. Um, Elements of that, like for instance in the Dungeons and Dragons movie, when there was a line where the dwarf says, "If you're not drinking, I'm not shopping." You know, that's something that brings out the character of the dwarf. The dwarf is known to have the Roland brogue, and having that brusque attitude, and when he tells the main character, um, he says, "You need to go get yourself a nice dwarf lass with a beard you can hang on to." You know, there's some comedy there, and that little bit of comedy will break up the tension and actually make the tense moments also more intense as you go along. So inject your games with comedy, and there's lots of ways to do this. Now, DMs can do this. The dice can help you. There's the critical success and the critical fumble in the dice. Whenever you roll a natural 1 or a 20, you could just say, natural 1, you dropped your sword, you broke your bowstring, you missed, and just go on with it. It's a critical fumble, so you missed, guaranteed not hit, move on. That's fine. You don't have to embellish that. But if you want to bring in a little bit of personality and comedy into your game, you could say, okay, you fumbled your bow shot, and give me another roll. And based on the other roll, you can say, okay, as you shoot the arrow, one of your companions jars your elbow, cause your shot to go high, ricochet off of the ceiling of the chamber, and actually hit your retainer in the foot. And then you get a little chuckle and laugh, and you realize, oh shoot, now you can't do that again. And you can do the same thing with a critical success. Okay, the natural 20s. You think of natural 20s as these awesome attacks that are perfect hits and everything, but they're not always necessarily perfect hits. They're just the most damaging hits and things that you could, for instance, you could have your clumsy wizard who has, for some reason, is in like a non-magical zone, so he's out of his element, and he's trying to fight, and he picks up one of the warrior's swords and comes thrusting out at the enemy, and he swings and he rolls a natural 20. Well, I mean, the wizard's not going to do necessarily a brilliant sly flourish and piercing stab through the abdomen or anything like your warrior would do. So instead, you might illustrate that as the wizard lurches forward, wielding the heavy sword, almost too heavy for him to lift. He swings it with all of his body weight behind it, his whole body spinning around, and just as he's about to drop the sword, he readjusts his grip, and in that readjusting, the sword sort of angles upward and slices right across the front of the neck of the half-orc he's fighting, causing it to half decapitate the creature and blood spurting out everywhere. And that's graphic and everything, but it's also comedic because you've got him fumbling and tripping, and in that tripping, you've got the bumbling hero that still does good, but he does it in a clumsy manner. How many times have you read a book? Books like from Craigshaw Gardner or Piers Anthony, where there's some heavy comedic battle scenes in there, and they talk about all these funny ways of taking on the bad guys, tripping and accidentally hurting the bad guy when really all you meant maybe was to scare them. And those are kind of things where you could do with a natural 20 or a fumble, natural 1 in the battle, but you inject that little bit of humor. And it talked about using humor in voices. Have humorous NPCs come meet your players, of course, the NPC, as I've talked about before, are your non-player characters. They're the little extras, the red shirts, as you would call them. And if you take your red shirts and make them humorous, they'll become more memorable in the mind of the players. I have a character in my homebrew games called Honest Conrad. And first of all, Honest Conrad's not one merchant. He's a whole family of merchants, and they're not all human. They're not even all male. They're just always Honest Conrad. And they show up when you least inspect them, like on the middle of the road. And when you ask them to find something in his wagon to sell you, oh, he's sure he's got it. And he'll climb in the back of that wagon and he'll throw out pots and pans and anything that's in his way while he's searching to find that thing that he thinks is going to fit your need. And I've got the characters out in the back of the wagon who've never met him before are making dexterity saving throws to avoid being hit by flying pots and kettles and um, half-eaten soup and things as he's throwing them out the wagon. And there's a little bit of a comedic slapstick Keystone Cop kind of feel to that situation. And of course, like I talked about with the gnome, Honest Conrad talks at 50 miles an hour. You know, a lot of times I'll come up with what he's got to say. I'll have a few catchphrases already written out for him, so I've got them memorized so I can go through them without taking a breath, just like I set up for the gnome, because he's a fast-talking flim-flam salesman. Although he is Honest Conrad. I mean, sometimes what he is selling the players is worth what they're paying for, or even worth more than what they're paying for. He's not always trying to cheat the players. Um, but he is a comedic character. Look at Matt Mercer when he creates his merchants. He had the flamboyant character that was male, but seemed to have kind of a special relationship with Liam O'Brien's character in the first campaign. And you weren't quite sure how serious he was, but he was very flamboyant and open and everything. And of course, that's not necessarily, for instance, sexual orientation profiling or anything. It's a personality. I know people that are that flamboyant and boisterous and stuff, and they're completely heterosexual. They could be homosexual, they could be bisexual, they could just be fun. And that's what he injected into that character. He gave the character a personality that everybody could get along with, and a personality that you remembered when you walked into his shop. And that bit of humor lasted. So every time you looked forward to those scenes when they came back and talked to the merchant again. Now, it's been a little bit since I've watched the first season of Critical Role, the first campaign. So I can't remember that character's name for the life of me right now. But in the second campaign, his main merchant is Pumat Sol. And Pumat is a furbolg who has all these clones of himself working in his shop. Everybody who works in Pumat's shop is Pumat. So you got Pumat Prime, and then you got all his clones. And he talks with like a slow Puma accent. I can't do the accent right now because I haven't heard it in a while. Again, I have been neglecting my Critical Role. What could I say? There's so many things to do in a day. You just can't fit everything in. I need to go back and pretty much rewatch the second campaign from the beginning. But I do love the character of Pumat Sol. And the reason I remember the character, even though I can't necessarily visualize to conceptualize the voice right now, is because of the voice. And because of the personality that he portrays, the comedic elements of Pumat, and how he's kind of got a slow, ponderous kind of talk to him, is very kind of dull, but not Eeyore dull. There's Eeyore from of course Winnie the Pooh, and that's the dull, slow, okay. It's not quite that, but it is a little bit slower on the uptake, a little bit more kind of a slow Andy Griffith kind of country bumpkin kind of sound. But he works in major shops in some major towns, so he's not a bumpkin. but he's a Furbolg, and you think of Furbolg, you think of him as naturalist, half giant, gentle giant, country bumpkin types. We think of gentle giants, we think of people like Andre the Giant. If you ever watch, Princess Bride, people often called him the gentle giant, and in real life, he was supposed to be one of the gentlest souls you'd ever meet. But he was this big, massive, strong man with hands the size of dinner plates. And that's kind of what you think of when you look at, like, for instance, Furbolgs. They're big teddy bears. They're cuddly. They're maybe a little bit simple and rustic, but there's a comedy to that stereotype that comes in, because stereotypes can be both good and bad. In NPC, stereotypes are used to accentuate certain characteristics in the character. They're not exactly stereotypes, because you can put a stereotype for one thing into someone of a different race, breed, color, sex, gender, what have you, but you're doing it to accent that one thing about the character, whether you're making sure every time that you meet up the character, they're a kobold, for instance, or a goblin. Say you got a goblin merchant, and every time you see it, you always have to point out how one ear is bigger than the other and has a lobe that droops down and almost brushes against his shoulder, and you fit that into the description when you come into every time you see him. And it's not even a major part of the game, but that comedic element is there. And that draws the people in. And you can do this in any kind of game, okay? Any tabletop role-playing game can have these comedic elements in them. If you think of some of your favorite sci-fi shows, there are large comedic elements in that. Firefly and Serenity, all kinds of comedic elements go through as you're watching those TV shows. And so if you were playing the Firefly game, you would want to inject that kind of comedy. Look at Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, of course, probably one of the most popular products that Joss Whedon ever came out with. Had 7 fantastic seasons. And when you're watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer, there's certain characters that are more meant there to be there for comic relief than they are to necessarily be useful. In a lot of the episodes, they do the reverse damsel in distress thing, and Xander Harris, played by Nicholas Brendon, is the hero in danger, not the heroine, but the hero. He's the male equivalent of a maiden in distress, and Buffy has to go help Xander, or Xander, whoever Xander falls in love with, turns out to be a monster, and that's a running joke in the game. Or even the fact of some of the relationship triangles and quadrangles and weird obtuse shapes that these relationships come into are involved with the humor in the game, in the show. When you watch the show and you find out that Xander Harris ends up in a love affair with Cordelia Chase, who all through the beginning of the show, Cordelia is his and Willow's arch nemesis. And she's the popular chick that nobody gets along with, and Xander kind of liked her, but he couldn't really fully admit to liking her because he hated her attitude so much, and they didn't mesh as two different cliques. So there was a comedic element involved when he finally got with Cordelia, and that's injecting some more humor back into what could admittedly be very serious subject matter in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The subject matter was about demons and werewolves and vampires, and they weren't your cuddly vampires. These vampires don't sparkle like in Twilight. There's nothing wrong with sparkly vampires. If that's your thing. Vampires can sparkle. I've seen so many different variations on the vampire theme that I don't blink when somebody does a new version of vampires. Everybody wants to get on a bandwagon to hate, the Twilight vampires. That's just another version in my book. Um, but these aren't your altruistic, nice vampires. These vampires are part demons. And the only real good vampire in the whole bunch for most of it is Angel. And that's because he was cursed to have his soul back. And then later, Spike kind of falls in love with Buffy. Again, another kind of obtuse relationship, to the point where Spike works to get his own soul restored to himself. And so both Spike and Angel become major plot points in the game, but they're also comedic in the very fact of there being vampires in love with the destined vampire slayer. And that's the same thing you do in your role-playing games. You inject that kind of comedy into your storyline. Instead of doing a boring trip from point A to point B, you're going from the village of Hamlet to the keep on the Borderlands. They're not too far away, a few days travel. Instead of just, fast traveling through or something, you can have all kinds of little bits of interesting byplay on the road just to make that a little bit more interesting. It kills a little bit of time for you as the DM so that everything's just not rushing through all at once. The players get a sense of time passing, which can be kind of important because a lot of times when you play these kind of games, you can lose that sense of time as being relevant. And that's when you get your players wanting to do things like taking a long rest after every battle. Because time doesn't matter, You can just reset all your stuff again. It's like playing a video game where you can just jump from save point to save point, and you don't realize that in D&D the save points are 16 hours apart. You take your 8 hours of time when you're in your save point, and then you have to go 16 hours ish before you can do that again. And you fill that 16-hour time period with all these different encounters. Well, a great way to get that feeling of time moving forward is to fill that time not just with combat encounters. I mean, sure, you can have a gauntlet of encounters. In fact, you can have a slapsticky comedic gauntlet if you want to inject humor in a day. For some reason, maybe they picked up some item. They have no idea that this item is causing them to get attacked left, right, and right. And they don't know why everybody else is walking along this road just fine, but they keep coming across every kind of monster imaginable. And it turns out it's because they've got a cursed item in their bag. And there's some magic and comedy involved with the curse. That could be it. But there's other things that can bring that travel along, and comedic non-combat situations are one of the things you can do. You can have them come across a broke down wagon with peasants having a stereotypical husband-wife argument. Oh, you never fix these things. It's all your fault. Why did I let you talk me into coming to this? And you can be that naggy wife or naggy husband, or put up on wife or husband while the kids are running around not getting anything done and just becoming a distraction. And just the few minutes that you took to describe that, and the delay that it causes on their trip on the road, can give more of an illusion of movement and time passing to your players. That's what comedy does in these situations. Not only does it break up the tension and make some of the drama more dramatic when it actually happens, but it also gives that illusion of progress and movement. Things aren't always grimdark. Death, destruction. They're not always political intrigue and backstabbing. Sometimes you've just got a drunken peasant who's slapstick drunk, and your job is basically to get him home in one piece. And that could spark an entire campaign. So remember to inject comedy into your game. Why else would all these great comedians have been members of the D&D world? I think his last name is Posen, who plays in Force Grey under Matt Mercer. He's a comedian. We would recognize him from Big Bang Theory and some other shows like that. Really tall, kind of a round egg-shaped head, comedian, kind of a dull-sounding voice. He played the geologist, friend of Leonard in Big Bang Theory, and Posen is, I believe, his last name, and he plays a bard named Calliope in Force Grey, which is a mini series that Matt Mercer sometimes DMs special. And it's one of the ones that Deborah Ann Wall was introduced to the more public D&D gaming through, because Joe Manganiello brought her in to a Force Grey thing she'd always wanted to play, but she'd never gotten to, and now she took to it like a fish to water. Loves the game. Most of us are finding that once we get in this game is such a great fit for us, but you got to realize that the reason it is a great fit for people is because it does appeal to more than one aspect of your personality, and that includes your funny bone. So take the comedy in the games, and like I said, it fits in all genres of games. Star Wars, there's all kinds of little comedic things in Jar Jar's in Star Wars, like Jar Jar Binks. A lot of people call Jar Jar Binks the big blasphemy of the prequels of Star Wars, but he was a comic relief character, just like the Ewoks were in the later editions. There were even lines between the more serious characters, like when Han turns to Chewie and says, "Laugh it up, furball." You kind of have to chuckle at that. There are comedic things, and then we even take those movies that aren't 100% serious already, and we make them even more slapstick by doing parodies of them. And you can have a parody adventure. Like, for instance, the parody of Star Wars is Spaceballs, Mel Brooks. And you could do a Mel Brooks edition one-shot every once in a while of your D&D game where you're going into some real obtuse areas. Like the Feywild is supposed to be a world of kind of chaotic Fey movements. There's nothing is truly stable and everything, and it's a perfect thing. You could have them in a world that's basically a living Escher drawing, where up and down and left and right and sideways are all relative to where you are at a given time. If you've ever seen an Escher drawing, you know that that's kind of the perspective that Escher drew in his paintings. So you'd be going up stairs one way, and then you would defy gravity and go another way, and that would keep fluid. And that's the kind of environment that is described for chaotic areas like the Feywild. Well, you could do an adventure in the Feywild, and because of that Escher element, that chaotic element of the environment, there's all kinds of room for comedic versions of things there. There's a creature in an old D&D book called a Svart, and it's kind of like a bald-headed, big, well, not big. They were short creatures like goblins and stuff, but I like to look at the picture, and it almost looks like they're wearing a comedic bowler hat, and that's just their bald pate. But it's comedic to me anyway. And you could populate your worlds with these more comedic monsters. Kobolds can be played both as little nuisances or little comedic pests that are always yipping and laughing. Gnolls are hyena men. Hyenas are known for having a laugh. The hyena's typical sounds like the hyena is sarcastically laughing in the wild, the actual animal. And so bringing in a hyena man like a gnoll or a flind, which is an advanced gnoll from older editions, into your game, you can have them laughing like the Joker in Batman. And for them, it's a part of their bestial personality, but that laugh could be that eerie laugh that also brings you in mind of Pennywise the Clown, or the Joker as played by Heath Ledger in the Christopher Nolan version of Batman, where the Joker was a really disturbed individual, and that laugh kind of showed that he was a little bit insane, just a little bit out there. And that bit of comedy can also add a bit of psychological horror into your games. So you can do that with superhero games where you actually have your characters fight people like the Toy Master, the Joker, the Riddler. These are comedic villains. The Penguin. I mean, who's scared of a villain that's based on a bunch of penguins, flightless birds that like the cold temperatures? It's not that scary. But the Penguin was one of the darkest villains in Batman's history. And part of it was his kind of comedic nature, his obsession with birds and his obsession with umbrellas. You know, those are just little quirks that they had. And those little quirks are comedic in nature, but they bring the story alive. Characters have quirks. BBEGs, or big bad evil guys, have quirks. And those quirks can be comedic in nature, and they bring the character to life. And so when you inject comedy into your game, throughout the game, you're making it to where you've set a precedence that comedy does exist, that not everything is 100% as serious all the time. And so they don't start taking your big bad evil guys for granted because you've added comedy to them, because you put comedy in other elements of the game, so they're not automatically being signaled that this is not a serious aspect of the game. Be Robin Williams behind your DM screen. Be that Joker. Approach them with the good morning, kind of thing, like Adrian Cronauer in the Vietnam, the character that he played for Good Morning Vietnam. He brought comedy to things. Be the members of MASH. Be Alan Alda's Hawkeye, always getting, something over on the system and on the army. Be Radar O'Reilly, who's, the sweet and innocent guy who, sometimes has an angle and you're not quite sure what it is, whether it's getting lifts to make everybody think he's taller, or trying to get a get-rich scheme by selling black and white leather shoes, or, what have you. Add personality to your characters, add personality to the characters that are playing in your game when you're helping them build their backstories. Inject some comedy in there. Not every backstory is just doom and gloom. Backstories should have a mix of comedy and tragedy. Comedy and tragedy go hand in hand. They're the two sides of what they call the theater mask, the symbol of the theater, the comedy and tragedy masks. Those are the two sides, comedy and tragedy. And that was because the great thespians like Shakespeare knew that in great tragedy there is also comedy, and vice versa. Within great comedy there can be tragedy. And when you bring the two together seamlessly, you've created a more vibrant world that's more believable, because our brains know that nothing is 100% one way or the other. And no matter how, think of the movie The Matrix. They talked about how the first Matrix was an idyllic world where nothing went wrong and everybody lived in perfect harmony, and the human mind rejects it because we don't believe in perfect harmony. We don't believe that's possible. Everybody talks about heaven, but nobody believes it exists, to the point where they'll totally grasp onto it. And that's true. We are used to the foils. In cooking, we call some of these seasonings a foil. You put a different texture or flavor into something that you'd never expect to go into it, to give the tongue something to grab onto. Like, for instance, if you were one of those coffee drinkers, you like a really sweet cup of coffee, so you put like 20 spoons of sugar in your morning coffee. Well, after you put about 7 or 8 spoons of sugar, it's not getting any sweeter at all. Believe me, it really isn't. At that point, it's just getting thicker. It's not really getting any sweeter. Your tongue's not registering it. However, and I've proven this, and you can do this as a joke to your friends, have them put the 7 or 8 sugars in there, even though they say they need like 20 packets of sugar. They're not getting any more sweet. Have them only do the 7 packets of sugar, then reach over with your salt shaker and just put a sprinkle of salt in that coffee and let them stir it in, and then taste it. And that contrasting flavor, the salt flavor, will intensify the sweetness of the sugar, and then it'll be too sweet for them because it's a foil. And that's what we're used to in our lives. We know we need all elements in order to really grasp the game. Let's see. And we have a somebody in the chat room. I don't know if he's still here or not. Welcome, Godly Demon 101. If you have a question about injecting humor into your D&D or other role-playing games, definitely let me know. I don't know how much longer I'll be broadcast. I don't even know how long I've been broadcasting right now. I just noticed you in the chat room. I've got the chat room up on my TV in front of me, but I've got it muted so you don't hear my voice echo back out at me. Open to my chat, to my broadcast. A lot of times I do these broadcasts and I don't have anybody come in because I do them late at night. I do it when I can get in here and not have a bunch of real life people interrupting me with what they're going about their days. And of course, during the day, my girlfriend works from home and she needs all the bandwidth to do her work from home. So she's not allowed to have anybody else on the bandwidth at that time. And using my phone as a modem is not the best way to do broadcasts to Twitch. So I don't. But I'm always glad to see somebody jump in. And if you like what I'm talking about, you want to hear more, if you want to check out some of my videos, do go to my YouTube channel. You can search Gamer Seuss. That's GAMERSEUSS on YouTube, and you'll see some other videos in my RPG College series. Where we talk about all kinds of things. Today, we're just doing a ramble about humor in the game. I was mentioning some of the great actors and comedians, past and present, that were D&D gamers. I started off misquoting Robin Williams from Good Morning Vietnam. It was Good Morning D&D. Welcome to D&D, a place more stimulating than a hot cup of cappuccino or espresso enema. And it's what's funny is Robin Williams is a known D&D player. He played D&D for many years. And that segued into the fact that humor in gaming is an important aspect. And that what I was rambling on when I did see that you had entered the room is that humor is that foil that we grab onto. It can make tension more tense, drama more dramatic, and vice versa. That little bit of drama can make comedy more comedic, more slapsticky sometimes. You don't always want your games to devolve into slapstick, but sometimes it's a good pressure relief, a pressure valve release. Sometimes you just need to giggle and laugh, big hearty belly laughs for no reason to get through the stress of the day. Because that's it, when it's all said and done, one of the big things that Dungeons and Dragons and games like it is they're stress relievers. They're ways that we deal with stress. They're ways that we learn to socialize with our friends. They're ways we can sometimes deal with and learn to cope with our quote-unquote enemies. I don't think most people actually have enemies as much as like superheroes and supervillains do. But those people, we have people we like and people we don't like, people we get along with and people we don't get along with on a day-to-day basis. But one of those commonalities, one of those grounds where we can actually come together with those people is through games like Dungeons and Dragons. And when you inject comedy into your Dungeons and Dragons, you are actually making it easier to really relate with people in the Dungeons and Dragons world, in the interaction world. I use D&D to counsel social anxiety disorder sufferers, and comedy is a big part of that, because a lot of times, like autistic children, I've done this with autistic children, they don't get the same humor that everybody else has. They're not quite understanding the jokes, and we don't understand their version of jokes. And it's not because either one of us doesn't have a sense of humor, but it's because we look at the world differently. Um, I've went ahead and switched the picture over to Robin Williams just to give you something else to look at other than that old Dragon magazine cover. The Dragon magazine cover, for you that came in late, was, like I said, an April Fool's cover from when Dragon magazine was published as a physical magazine on a monthly, bi-monthly basis by TSR. And it was an example of how Gary Gygax knew, even in the early days of D&D, that humor was an important part of it. And so he wrote some humorous modules, and every year he made a point of doing a April Fool's issue of his Dragon magazine, where he introduced things like comedic monsters that you could do. Like, for instance, you could take the gelatinous cube, a very popular monster in Dungeons and Dragons, which is a big transparent cube of living protoplasm, basically. A type in the ooze family of monsters, but this one happened to be a cube. But he would put in there was a monster in one issue, I want to say episode, but a really issue of Dragon Magazine that introduced the Jello mold monsters. And they were Jello molds, different fruity flavors and colors. And that was the comedic aspect. Or you might fight gummy bears, giant animated gummy bears instead of regular bears. These were some of the things. You could fight rock candy monsters. You could do a variation on the Hansel and Gretel myth and come up to a witch with a house made out of candy, and the comedy involved in that little bit of lore coinciding with D&D will help people get into the game, especially if you run games for children. Children identify with humor. If you want to get a child more into something, turn it into a joke. Now, children will also obsess on a joke and sometimes not let you get over that joke. They're going to keep coming back to it and keep coming back to it. So you do have to give them the joke, let them chuckle for a little bit, then move them away from the joke. And be careful not to reassociate to that joke too often. Excuse me. Because they will lock onto it and they'll giggle about that one joke for your whole session. And you might spend a whole session, instead of gaming, really rehashing or trying to get away from a joke. So that's a risk. But you do need to bring that comedy into your gaming environment. The humorous NPC, the humorous monster, the big bad evil guy that's got a funny name, who wants to fight Poindexter the Wizard? I mean, I could even, I might give Poindexter the Wizard Dexter from Dexter's Laboratory's voice. You got stupid. And I would use that. And of course, kids would latch onto that and they would start copying me all the time. Whether they could do the voice or not, they'll be like, you're stupid. You're stupid. Yes. No, Diddy. Get out of my laboratory. And stuff. DMs use funny voices to bring comedy into the game. Talked about Robin Williams, of course, who is famous for, among his many voices, his Scottish brogue, which is also the stereotypical voice for every dwarf ever played in every D&D game. If you don't know how to do any other voices, all your dwarfs are Scottish or Irish. They've got heavy brogues. Every once in a while, it's nice to see one it's more Yump and Yemeni. It's a Scandinavian dwarf, a little bit more historically accurate, actually. But all your dwarfs have got Scottish brogues or Irish lilts in their voice. And they all talk like bad Robin Williams jokes, like when he's talking about golf. But using those voices make things. You can talk in a high falsetto voice for your elves, You know, because most people can't necessarily do a lilting, mystically alluring, androgynous voice, which is more like how elves are usually personified. But you could probably do a really high pitch, like I don't know what that one was. Oops, I was disconnected. I think I'm reconnected though. It doesn't look like I've got interruption on my screen. Let's see. Okay, there's interruption.